Welcome to the Tudor Dixon Podcast. Today we have one of my most awkwardly favorite subjects because I try to educate people as much as I can about the psychiatric care industry and what these drugs are doing to people who are being overdiagnosed, overprescribed. And I feel like sometimes I'm just yelling into this echo chamber and no one's really listening. And then last night, I think it was last night or over the weekend, I was on X and I saw this tweet from this woman and I was like, yes, this is someone who can speak from true life experience and has created an entire career over helping people who don't need to be on these medications get off. So I have Laura Delano with me today. I'm so excited about it. I'm so excited about what you do. Laura, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Tudor. I'm so happy to be here.
Your story is interesting because, like I said, you are someone who was put on medications. And I guess when we're talking about this, kind of explain what we're talking about with psychiatric medications and what your journey was from age 14 to 27 on these medications.
So yeah, when we talk about psychiatric meds, we're talking about antidepressants, benzodiazepines. So, Prozac is an antidepressant, Klonopin is a benzodiazepine, and then mood stabilizers like lithium, Lamictal, antipsychotics like Risperdal, Seroquel, and then stimulants like Ritalin and Adderall, and sleep aids like Lunesta or Ambien. So those are the kind of broad drug classes. And for me, I ended up taking all of them over the years in varying combinations. And as a 14-year-old, what got me into this whole long relationship with these medications that I ended up having was that I was just a struggling girl who was angry and confused about who she was, and I felt overwhelmed by despair, and I was injuring myself and spinning out at home, and my parents just didn't know what to do, and they were scared and confused, and they felt very alone with the experience. And so they sent me to a therapist who eventually sent me to a psychiatrist who, in the span of one session, told me that I was bipolar, and that because I was angry and having anger outbursts and rage issues, those were symptoms of mania. And then the despair and the cutting and the down feelings that I was having were symptoms of depression. So like that, in the snap of a finger, I was told I had this lifelong illness that required meds. And I was put right out the gates on a mood stabilizer and on an antidepressant. But that list grew over time.
Yeah, I've had a very similar experience with someone that I love in my family who went and said, I've forgotten, literally first appointment, I've forgotten a few things. I've had some where I get distracted easily when I'm working and then forgotten things at home. And without that's what blows my mind. You can't do a blood test, but there's no actual written exam. There's nothing. It was a 15-minute appointment in the doctor's office, immediately 5 medications, one of which was Adderall, which is someone who they said, oh, well, you're anxious, but you also have ADHD. So we're going to put you on an anti-anxiety drug and Adderall at the same time. And it was just like this clash of chemicals inside of this person's body seemed shocking.
Yeah. Yeah. And what happened to your family member is how it is for literally every single person who gets a diagnosis in this country. It's based on completely subjective observations made by the clinician. There are no tests of any kind, no lab tests, no brain scans. It's these emotional difficulties, these behavioral struggles. These get kind of translated into this medical language, of symptom and condition. And we just take for granted that that's what they are, that there must be some pathology in me if a doctor's telling me I have this. But when you step back and you actually think it through, you're like, wait a minute, this doesn't really make sense here.
Yes. And that, I think, is what you just said is key, is that we always assume the doctor's right. If a doctor told me this, then this must be the case. And honestly, this was how I felt up until I'm a cancer survivor. And when I went to the first doctor, they had this cockamamie idea of what they were going to do. And I was like, man, that sounds intense. Like, I think I'm going to go to a few different people. And I had never really been that person, which this also sounds crazy, but I'd never really had a big medical experience before. So I had never been that person to go get 2 and 3 opinions on something. But that was that moment where I went, man, medicine is different depending on who you talk to. Every different person has a different impression of how to solve your problem. But when it comes to something psychiatric, what I think is so key and what I love about what you've done in your book that is Unshrunk, A Story of Psychiatric Treatment Resistance, is that I don't think a lot of people, including parents, understand, and I don't think it's explained to us what the side effects of these medications are.
You're totally right. And we're not only not told about the side effects, but we're also not told about the evidence base upon which these drugs are approved to even begin with. So for example, when I was put on these meds as a 14-year-old and my parents and I were told I would need them for the rest of my life, no one said, and just by the way, these drugs have actually only been studied for about 6 to 8 weeks before we approve them. No one ever said, just by the way, this combination we have you on has never been studied for safety and effectiveness. So it's both the evidence base itself that we're not told about, and then, as you said, the long list of adverse effects, which, you know, are in the drug labels. They are spoken quickly at the end of drug ads. It's not like no one knows that these drugs have problematic adverse effects, but I think we're so desensitized to that because we hear all those drug ads day in and day out and the long list of symptoms at the end. I think it doesn't sink in the way that it should. And I think, and also because so many of the adverse effects mimic psychiatric conditions themselves or, you know, other health conditions, we have this, we're trained to not kind of think critically about how the pharmaceuticals that we take are going to be altering our bodies. And instead, when we have problems, we end up getting new diagnoses that end up needing more medications.
Well, that's another one that I love. This is causing this, so we're going to add this. And that's kind of, I think that's how Ambien actually gets added to the protocol sometimes because, oh, wait, this stimulant won't let you sleep. Well, let's put this on and now you'll sleep, and you'll sleep in this weird drug-induced coma that doesn't actually give you good sleep. And you might make yourself a meal in the middle of the night and crochet an entire throw for your couch. You know, like just
Totally.
is bizarre.
Oh my gosh, Tudor, when I was on Ambien, so I was on Ambien for years. You know, of course, this drug is not approved for more than 2 weeks. And I would, without fail, black out after about 23-ish minutes. And I'd wake up in the morning and I would have empty bowls, empty cereal box, bowls, spilled milk everywhere. I'd write weird things in my journal. And then, as you said too,
how scary is that?
I ended up feeling so sedated during the day that I started on Provigil, which is an anti-narcoleptic drug. So I was literally on an insomnia drug at night and an anti-narcoleptic drug during the day at the same time, not to mention like 2 or 3 other meds too. I mean, it was wild. And I never
And then who
this.
are you as a person?
Yeah. Yep. That's the question. And especially for those of us who end up on these meds as kids, when we haven't even had a chance yet to forge a sense of ourselves, you know, and adolescence, which was when I got psychiatrized, as I like to put it, I was just waking up to self, to my body, to how I fit into the world around me. I had all these questions and these struggles that I now see were these meaningful, deep, profound questions. And because I got diagnosed so young and I got put on these meds, that process was interrupted, was disabled really. And so I had no baseline sense of myself through these critical years of my life, my teens and my 20s, which in turn made it hard to then extricate myself from it because I didn't have an old me to look back to. You know, sometimes people who start meds later in life and, you know, they realize like, hey, I'm not really the way I used to be. Like, I'm not the same mom I was 5 years ago, or I'm not the same, you know, person at work. Maybe something's going off with these meds. When you're a kid, you don't have anything to compare yourself to. And so I think it's especially insidious for young people.
And I think in our generation, that's when it really, well, you're a little younger than me. So I think that I didn't go through, it wasn't until I think maybe I was in high school that the younger generation was coming in using Ritalin, and there was like this real push for Ritalin. I remember that being, and I don't remember people in my class being on medication or talking about it, but it was almost like a badge of honor for the younger kids. Like, well, I'm on Ritalin, I have a special dispensation here because I'm on this or I'm on that. And then that kind of expanded. And I think it became incredibly normal for us to go, oh, is this person struggling with coping with something? Then there's got to be a med for that. We're the quick fix society. And you're right. Those ads were very so quick and so fast and so constant that even though they said, if you're feeling thoughts of suicide or harming someone else, go to a doctor, we just kind of forgot about that. And I wasn't, so the first, and this may be a place you don't want to go and you can tell me to stop if you don't want to, but the first school shooting was right after I graduated from high school. I was in college at the time. I was actually graduating college at the time. And I interviewed a psychiatrist who met with Dylan and the other kid now, his name escapes me, but met with them or read their file. The one that was 19 read his file. And he was like, look, kids have not become less depressed and they've become more violent since we've been giving them all these medications. He said, I forced the FDA to say, these ads had to say, you might be considering suicide or harming someone else. He was like, I guarantee you, if you look at every school shooter, they have one of these medications in their system. Why don't we talk about that?
It's such an important question. And I think whether it's, because the story is about most mass shooters, oh, this was someone with untreated mental illness, quote unquote. And then that's why they did this. But as you said, if you look at the stories of many, if not most, if not all of them, they were already interfacing with the mental health system in some way. And so whether they were on these drugs when they committed these horrific acts, or maybe in some cases had stopped these drugs abruptly, which itself can cause withdrawal symptoms that literally are suicidal or homicidal ideation. I mean, I wouldn't be, because they've made it so hard to look at these shooters' medical records. I have a friend who's a professor who tried to FOIA them and couldn't get them. We can only ask these questions, but I think it's worth asking them. And the fact that these questions are getting shut down, I think, indicate something important. And just to quickly piggyback on what you said about what you saw in high school with the rise of stimulants, you're hitting something so important, which is that, in the case of stimulants and this ADD thing and ADHD and school and performance, instead of stepping back to say, like, why do we all force ourselves into this one rigid way of learning in this one rigid school system that some kids do well in, but some kids don't? Why are we doing this? Do we have to do it this way? I think it's a lot easier and more convenient to say, oh, this one individual kid here, something's wrong with him because he can't sit in his desk for 6 hours straight and not get sunlight and focus on, mundane tasks. I think pathologizing kids and making them the problem instead of stepping back to problematize the school system itself, I think that is a part of what's happened here with this predominance of the psychiatric paradigm, is that instead of looking at the context of our lives and understanding our behaviors and our struggles as responses to the environment that we're in, to the food we're putting in our body, to the breakdown of social networks and neighborhoods and intergenerational families. I mean, the list is endless. Poverty, all these possibilities. Instead of doing that, we say, oh, the problem's inside of your brain and here's a pill. And I think we're finally reaching a point where enough people are realizing, does that really make sense?
And I mean, it's crazy because you really are altering their brain chemistry, but then there's not, like I said, there's no actual test. I mean, if you have a broken arm, the fix, right? And then the arm is no longer broken and you move on with life. When you have someone who has a broken heart or, thinks things that are sad or depressed, there is no obvious answer. And I talked a little before we got on. When my daughter was 8, she was just anxious. They had talked about germs in school, but I couldn't figure out what had set her off, if it was that, but she was so concerned about germs. She was freaking out if anybody would get near her. And so we talked about it at her well child visit. She should go to a therapist and talk to the therapist. And again, this was at a point where I'm like, I want to be obedient to my doctor because my doctor knows. And we went to the therapist And the therapist saw her for probably about, I mean, I'll give her credit. She saw her for probably about 4 visits before saying she has to be on 2 different medications and you have to go to a psychiatrist. And I said, well, we're not interested in that. And then the next day, I got a call from the pediatrician's office. And she's like, we received this long letter. Your daughter has to be on an antidepressant and an anti-anxiety medication. And I was like, well, I'm not going to do that. And they're like, you don't, well, it's in the file now. You have to go. And I got to the point where I was getting calls from them. I was getting calls from the psychiatrist's office. And I was afraid I was going to get a call from the state saying like you have to get your kid on medication. And I finally just said, look, it's not going to happen. I'm going to block the number if you keep calling me. And we went home. And I said, okay, I'm going to pour everything into figuring out when something happens, what we do. And there was like, I started reading about it, and certain kids have like soothing mechanisms. And for her, it's like, if you can get to her and like kind of rub her back and be like, we're okay. That's like, to her, it brings down all those emotions. She can calm down. And just last week was the end of school. And at the end of school, the teachers like say these affirmations over the kids. And over and over again, the teachers were saying, she's such a light. She's such a bright light in our class. She's just always cheerful. She is the kid that brings other kids in. And I think to this day, if I had done that those years ago, would she be a light?
Oh my gosh, Tudor, I feel so emotional thinking about it because there's so many kids out there who have parents who don't necessarily have they
don't know.
They don't know. They feel pressured into it. They're insecure. They're afraid. They're confused. And the number of parents who have reached out to me with kids who are now in their 20s, some even in their 30s, who say, "Oh my gosh, what did I do 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago when I listened to what the school said about getting my kid on Adderall, or I listened to them telling me I needed to take my kid to a psychiatrist." And now, all these years later, their young adult children are oftentimes disabled, unable to work, completely dependent on their families. And all, of course, this is all being translated into illness. Oh, that they're just very mentally ill. But when I think about my experience, through my 20s, as I got more and more disabled in mind, body, and spirit, of course, every step of the way, it was 2 meds, 3 meds, 4 meds, 5 meds. It was the meds that were injuring me and harming me in all of these ways that my parents and I just didn't see because we were so unquestioning of these top doctors. Because I came from a family of socioeconomic means, I was seeing the best of the best. So who would we be to have questioned? And so I really feel for the bind that so many parents are in who don't have resources, who don't have the time to educate themselves, who feel who don't feel, confident in their voice. How do we support them? Because a lot of them, are they mean well and they love their kids. They want to do what's best for their kids, and they just they're doing the best they can with what they have. And so how do we get them what they need?
Well, and explain to me a little bit about what that was like for you, because my experience with folks who are not only the parents, but the actual patient themselves is like, there's this inability to admit that maybe I've done something wrong, and that there's an inability to see that there is a more complete and exciting life without these medications dimming you. And like you said, it really is, you become disabled. It's like a fog over how you can accomplish things. I mean, I have people that I know that are like, I just can't get from here to there. And they don't see that it's the medication. So how do you open their eyes to, this is the medication. There's no shame in it. You are allowed to let it go, and don't fear letting it go, because you've even said you work with people on this and they go, I'm afraid of a relapse. I might have to go back to the meds.
Oh, it's such an important question. And I wish there was like one clear path of an answer. I mean, I know for me, when I look back, so as I said, my 20s, as my med list grew and I grew more and more disabled, I grew more and more hopeless along the way, because eventually I was told that I had, so-called treatment-resistant bipolar disorder, which basically meant like, oh, you are just so defective that even our treatments can't help you. And
what a horrible thing to think.
It was that story that led me to eventually try to kill myself because I was completely convinced that I had exhausted every option that might give me a chance at feeling okay and what's left for me. And so when I eventually did, 2 years after my overdose was the year that I woke up, you could say. And what actually what started to jolt me awake, what was like the first kind of thing that forced me to step back and begin questioning was having a few experiences with psychiatric force, basically with the power that mental health professionals have to strip you of your civil liberties. So I was made to go into a hospital when I didn't want to go in. I actually did want to go. I just wanted to go home to get my belongings first. Security guards were called. There was a whole thing. That was the first time I was forced up against this realization that this system I had been turning to for care was actually also about control, about controlling me. And I just hadn't seen it because I had never said no before. So I had a couple of other experiences like that just got me questioning this faith I had had in all of these doctors and all these pills and these hospitals and programs for so many years, 14 years. And then in that space of questioning, I began to wonder, who would I be off of these meds that I've been on since I was a kid? It was just this question at first. And it kept nagging at me because I realized I didn't have any sense of myself off meds. And I had never been off meds as an adult. And so those curious questions just kept eating at me. And then I eventually did find a book that led me on this journey that I'm still on today. And the book was written by a medical journalist. And it was basically looking at, why do we have such poor long-term outcomes in the United States compared with, other parts of the world that aren't developed, that don't have all these pharmaceutical products. And what he found was that if you actually look at the outcomes, if you look at the long-term data on psychiatric drugs, they're making us sicker. You can make a strong case for that. So I had that aha moment then when I read this book and I was on 5 meds and my whole life had fallen apart during the years I was on them. And I realized oh my gosh, what if it's the treatment? And so, but you can't force that awakening in someone. You can't make someone see. And so I think what it's really about is creating opportunities for people to identify with this story in someone else. I mean, that's why I wrote my book. I wanted to write a book that I could put out into the world to start a conversation and that might help spark a sense of identification in other people who maybe haven't yet realized that my story might well be their story too. So I think telling personal stories, putting our stories out there, and then just creating opportunities for people to step back and ask questions and be curious, because you can't force an aha moment in someone, and everyone's path to that is different. But I think the storytelling aspect, I think, is really big, because that's what also helped wake me up. That book I was mentioning, there were stories in it, and I saw myself in the other people's stories in this book. And that's, I think, why I was able to say, holy cow, what if it's the treatment?
We've got more coming up with Laura Delano, but first I want to talk to you about my partners at Ease. Great news. President Trump's executive order slashing the cost of prescription drugs is going after price gouging for drugs like insulin with Obamacare. You've heard me on this show introduce to you our new healthcare partner, Ease for Everyone, which is a solution to what President Trump is fighting for today and every day. Listen to these simple facts. With Ease for Everyone and a monthly cost as low as $262, you get over 400 prescription drugs for free. Not lower cost, but no cost, $0, plus huge savings on many other brand names. You actually get to keep your doctor, thanks for nothing, Obama. You get free, unlimited virtual primary care visits, unlimited urgent care for $30 copay, and generous cashback reimbursements for surgeries and hospital stays, including ICU visits, emergency room visits, ambulance transportation, and doctor's visits. Okay, so remember, that's $262 a month. You keep your doctor. You get over 400 prescription drugs for free. Visit today. It's easeforeveryone.com/tutor and join right now. That's easeforeveryone.com/tutor. You've got to sign up. Now stay tuned. We've got more coming up after this. This is a treatment. It's the only time we are willing to go to a doctor regularly and never be healed. that to me, so I was a psychology major in high school or in college. And as a psychology major at the university that I was at, you could work at there was like inside the university, there was a little psychiatric clinic. And so you could work there, and it was all the psychology students. And then I think they had a psychiatric portion as well. But if you were a student at the university in the psych or the psychology department, then you were able to read every single patient file, unless they were a student or somebody that worked at the university. So there was a massive amount of community members that came in, and they were patients there. And I was pretty deep. I mean, this is probably my junior or senior year. So at this point, I'm planning on going to get my master's degree and become a therapist myself. And this is my first kind of exposure to therapy. So you get to, I mean, you do all the filing and everything, but you really get to sit down and read the cases. And I remember sitting down with one, and I read day one, and his file was 10 years long. And I went to the 10th year, and the stories were the exact same. And there was this moment that struck me so hard where I said to myself, how do you live with this being your career if you can't help someone? Because there was no change in this person. And I asked that question. They were like, oh, we're not here to solve their problems. We're here to get them through week to week. And I thought, what a terrible way of looking at this. We're just here to keep them alive. They're miserable people. We're just here to keep them going from one miserable week to the next. And that was unacceptable to me. It's like, that is not what I thought this major was about. This is not what I thought we were here doing. I thought we were helping people. That was what I wanted to do, was to help people. And it seemed like they were keeping them trapped. And just the conversations, if you think about the conversation is kind of like it's a gossip session. Okay, well, how did that make you feel? Yeah, you had a right to feel that way. And it's almost like even the therapist, and I'm not saying this in all cases, because I do think there are times when therapy gets you through a situation. And that's the problem that we have. There are therapists who say, okay, you've had a death in the family, you went through and, had a marriage breakup or something. And there's let's go through the next few months of getting you back on track. And then you want to see the patient leave. The goal should be, in my mind, to want to see the patient leave. And yet there's a whole industry built around, in my town, the person has to have a meeting every week with their psychologist, to once a month have a meeting with their psychiatrist so that they can stay on all of their meds. It's like a cash cow. You have to have the gossip session once a week to get the meds. And that means that you're constantly paying these people to keep you in a bad place.
For me, beginning therapy as a kid, what should have been a period of my life when I was developing meaningful friendships that I could turn to my friends in times of struggle, turn to them for comfort, for mentorship, for guidance. I learned to turn more and more to these paid professionals whom I was seeing once a week and eventually twice a week. And the more kind of accustomed I became to relying on therapy as my source of support, the less even interested really I was in friendships to begin with. And I think what you were saying earlier too about when you were in your third year as a psych concentrator, and like what you were seeing with these years and years and years of people not getting better, that gets to the heart of this brilliant business model, really, that the mental health industry today is built upon, which is this idea of chronicity. These are chronic, incurable conditions that you'll have for the rest of your life, and it's about managing them, quote unquote, manage. I mean, that was the word that was used for me. This isn't about me, really growing, changing, transforming, evolving. This was about finding a med regimen that would help me, so-called manage my symptoms and get by. And if you look at the history of the mental health industry over the past 70, 80 years, prior to the rise of psychiatric drugs in the 1950s, the baseline operating assumption was that these challenges were episodic. Even extreme altered states that, today are called like these chronic conditions like bipolar and schizophrenia. Before the rise of the pharmaceutical industry, people assumed like you have hard times in life. Sometimes they last a few weeks, sometimes a few months, maybe sometimes longer, but you move through them. You move beyond them. And I think this medical model of incurable mental illness requiring lifelong treatment has just slowly over the decades led us to forget that these difficulties in life do not have to be forever.
It's normalized that we shouldn't actually have any difficulties. And that to me is, it's a weird thing because you don't have really medical malpractice when it comes to psychiatric care. And yet there are true great therapists who say, you went through something tough, let's get you through that and let's get you back into life as normal. And it is a few meetings and then you're off. But I do believe that there should be some accountability for people who keep people in this cycle of, you're right, that's really hard. No wonder you're depressed. And that's why you carry this label and other people don't, because you get these young people to believe there's no way out. I'm labeled this now. This is who I am.
Yep. And I think because as young people, we are searching for a sense of belonging. We're searching to understand ourselves and how we fit in and where we fit in. And one of the great tragedies, I think, of this really, overly medicalized society is that identity of being mentally ill, quote unquote, becomes speaking for myself, it became the thing that I was proud of. Because if I wasn't ever going to be able to be just a normal person, and of course today, like, what is normal? What does that even mean? But at the time, that's what I thought. Then at least let me get really good at being a psychiatric patient and at being crazy and mentally ill. And the more diagnoses, the more people will see how much I'm struggling, the more meds I take, the more they symbolize how much suffering I'm in. This whole realm of like medicalized, pharmaceuticalized living came to become the singular focus of my life, my sense of self, my relationships, my purpose. My purpose was being a good patient. And I think there's so many young people who grow up on meds, in therapy, thinking of themselves as sick. And this is not me judging any of them for this, because I relate. That was how I grew up too. But I see now in retrospect that what I was seeking, which was feeling seen and heard and understood in my struggles, I actually was doing the very opposite by medicalizing myself and thinking the solution was pills and professionals. What I really, for me now, the way I think we can most validate a struggle in life is as a response. You're having a response to something that's happening in your life. And this response is a signal. It's a message. It's telling you something about where you need to go from here. And if you listen to it instead of try to shut it down or medicate it or treat it, you open up all these possibilities for growth and change.
And I think it's important to kind of zoom out on your life, because I'm listening to you say this while in the back of my head, I'm thinking, here is someone who was a straight A student, a nationally ranked sportswoman, a Harvard student. I mean, you're saying like, I identified as being a good patient, but you had so many things that you were amazing, doing amazing things. What was that like? Because I think that people go, oh, this isn't my kid. This isn't my story because my student's a good student. My student didn't have these issues, but you fit all those categories too. So explain that.
When it might seem incongruous, but I actually think that a big part of why I broke down as a kid was because I grew up in a really intense town. I grew up in Greenwich, Connecticut. So this town with all these incredible opportunities and resources and all of that. But it was a really high pressured place where the unspoken kind of operating assumption of everyone was that if you want to feel worthy, you need to excel. And so I think because I was getting good grades and, a good student, quote unquote, in a kind of conventional way, I could study and get good grades on tests and and regurgitate information. And because I was a good athlete and all of these things, I was just assuming that, oh, I'm playing the game right, so maybe I'll eventually feel happy. And so the fact that, but what I was missing really was like, why? What do I care about? What ignites me? What brings me alive? What are my values? I was so programmed. I was so focused on this kind of programmed good grades, good sports, good schools, that those deeper questions I didn't have the chance to explore in myself. And so I was just assuming I'll eventually feel happy because I'm doing it right. And so, of course, when I broke down, because that's not how it works, I believed all the more that something must be fundamentally wrong with me because I have it all together. I've arrived at Harvard. I did everything I was meant to do. Why do I want to die? And so I was so terrified by that I think that desperation is what really drove me to then buy in so deeply into the idea that something was wrong with me.
And I think so I wanted to get to that because I think that's key, that it wasn't as though you were in an abusive home or you had some terrible thing happen. This is life. This is life. Every kid is experiencing life. And so often we say, you shouldn't have to feel that pain. You shouldn't have to feel upset about this. You shouldn't have to struggle with this. We'll make it easier. And every kid in class has a different diagnosis. And I've seen this throughout my daughter's lives. Here I have twins that are going to be in 7th grade. I've got one that's going to be a freshman in high school. I've got one that's going to be a junior in high school. And they're all girls. So I think even from that perspective, I've seen those types of pressures of girls being mean to girls. And yes, as a parent, you want to say, I don't want you to have to deal with this, but I have seen so many phases of life with these kids too. That's the key, is that there have been really hard years, not really hard seasons. I mean, we're talking about an entire year of high school that was really hard,
Yeah.
and we got through it together, but there were ups and downs. And I think we're so quick to say, we just want to fix this. But I want to get to you having this epiphany of like, oh my gosh, what if it's the treatment? Getting off of the treatment, that's not easy. What was that like?
Well, when I came off of 5 meds in 2010, so I was in my late 20s, I had no idea what I was doing. First of all, I had no idea that these drugs that I had been on for so many years had really changed my brain and my body. That I was physically dependent on them. No one told me this. I had no idea.
Well, I just want to stop you there because I hear so many times when people go, "Oh, it's not addictive." So that doesn't mean you're not dependent on it.
Yes, people conflate these words, addiction and dependence. And I think sometimes this is done deliberately because yes, you're not craving your next fix of your antipsychotic, but your brain may well be completely acclimated to your daily dose of your antipsychotic such that if you don't take it, it's going to go haywire. And so when you hear someone say, "Oh, these are not addictive," that may actually be, that is true, but that doesn't mean that they aren't dependence forming, which has nothing to do with cravings and kind of the psychological elements of what we conventionally understand addiction to be. Like, this alcohol is causing you harm, but you keep drinking it anyways. It's not like that. This is a different thing. This is about being a compliant patient, doing what you're told by your doctor, and that then leading your body to become totally dependent on these pills. So because I didn't know this, I was in this headspace of thinking that, I've got to get off these pills as fast as possible. If they've been harming me, I've got to get off of them so I can heal. I didn't realize that I had it backwards, that actually for many, many people, the fastest way to get off and stay off of these meds is to taper very, very slowly because of this dependence issue. And by slow, I don't mean over a few weeks or a few months or even a year. Some people need to taper over years to get off of these medications without causing profoundly disruptive withdrawal symptoms that can literally take you out of your life. I mean, I have friends who were brought off of, an antidepressant and a benzodiazepine. People who have work-related anxiety, this very kind of typical struggles that they got put on these meds for. they were brought off, over a few weeks or a month or so, and were literally bedridden because they had such horrible vertigo that they couldn't stand up. They would fall over, or the burning in their fingers and their feet is unbearable, or the brain zaps that a lot of people coming off antidepressants get, where you literally feel like you are having electrical shocks going off in your brain.
I mean, that's crazy in and of itself. When you're describing this, I'm like, this is what your body goes through coming off of these drugs, and yet we want to keep people on them?
Yep. And I think why people end up staying on them is that so there are those physical withdrawal symptoms that are strange, these brain zaps. Those are just such strange things that are so out of the ordinary. But a lot of withdrawal symptoms mimic the diagnoses themselves.
Yes.
And so when you come off, you've been on your Prozac for 15 years and you realize, like, I don't think I need to take this anymore. And you come off and you feel horribly anxious, down in the dumps, you lose energy, or, maybe you can't sleep or you're restless. And you realize, like, gosh, I really was depressed. I just didn't realize it because I was on my meds. Like, I need to go back on my meds. I don't want to feel this way. And I think that because we don't have this understanding of dependence and withdrawal, people stay in this loop for years and years and years because they hate how they feel when they stop their meds. And so a lot of what my work is about is not pushing any kind of agenda. I'm not anti-med. I'm about informed choice. We are not being informed about the drugs before we start them, and we are not being informed about how to come off of them safely. And I want everyone should have the right to this information so that they can decide for themselves what their next right step is. And I believe that right now, basically, none of us are making informed choices because we're not being told any of this.
What do you think about the diagnosis process? Because I think that you had at one point major depression, eating disorder, substance abuse disorder, borderline personality disorder, bipolar, all of these things they had said, oh, it's this, it's this, it's this. Do you believe that they really understand what they're doing when they diagnose?
Well, I think the diagnostic process, what I failed to understand, and I think a lot of people fail to understand, is that the process of diagnosing with someone with a psychiatric condition is not a scientific process that's rooted in anything scientifically valid or reliable. It's a very subjective process that is largely about the opinion of the person doing the diagnosing. And so in that sense, the DSM, psychiatry's Bible that all of these diagnoses live in, I don't really take it seriously as a valid scientific text at all. I think it's more of a kind of work of fiction, really. But that isn't me saying that these experiences aren't real. Sometimes people can think that when I'm challenging the diagnostic paradigm, I'm challenging the reality of the struggles that people have. And I am not doing that. For me, the fact that I had, 6 or 7 different diagnoses along the way, and that they would change, and different doctors had different opinions, and when you look at the history of the DSM itself, these conditions are voted in and voted out. That's how if a diagnosis is in the DSM, it's because a group of psychiatrists voted on it, and that's why it's there. And so when people realize that, then some of us start to wonder, like, is this really the most useful way to make sense of my difficulty here, to just reduce it to this label? Or maybe there are other ways to make sense of this struggle. And by making sense of it differently, you end up opening up different options for you. Because if it's not a so-called illness needing treatment, then, it can mean so many different things that then open up maybe changing your diet.
Right.
There's so many relationships,
there's so many different ways that you can have something that appears like major depression, but it could be something that happened in your life. It could be a temporary condition that you have to talk through. You could have something that appears to be your standard eating disorder, but it might be one person has that eating disorder because they need control. The other person may have that eating disorder because it's a social contagion and their friend has that and they're in a bad environment and you need to get them out of that. I mean, that is the concern, is how do you get to the root cause of a psychiatric condition? They're very hard. It's very hard to do that.
It's very hard. And I think especially for people who've been struggling for a long, long time, like let's take the kind of stereotypical example of the man on the subway, the homeless man on the subway who's talking to himself and acting really wacky and scary. I think so many of us just assume, oh, this person must have this serious illness like schizophrenia and he's off his meds and that's why he's acting this way. But if you step back and think about it, at one point, that man was a little boy and things happened to that boy. Needs were not met. Maybe things happened to that boy that never should happen to a child. And when you think about the kind of cumulative effect over years and years and years of not having basic needs met, of having traumatic things happening, of being maybe put on meds that cause all these problems, and then you get stuck in this cycle where you stop them abruptly and you go into withdrawal, but everyone thinks you're having a relapse. And just you think about all the layers of trauma and unmet needs and in all these kind of systems failing, it makes sense then that eventually a person reaches this extreme point where they're kind of seen as this other being that's not like me. And I think it for me, it's about, stepping back and realizing that every single person has a story behind why they're in the struggles that they're in. And sometimes the story is obvious and sometimes it's not obvious and sometimes it's long and complicated. And so I'm not someone who's like, oh, it's all simple. Let's just, if we stop diagnosing people, there won't be problems. Life is really hard, messy, sometimes violent, awful things happen. I'm not pretending there's some easy solution here, but I think we need to all realize that every struggling person has a story, and the current mental health industry doesn't often make space for those stories to be understood.
And help people to cope through life on a regular basis. And so I want to just end on what you're doing now, because you're kind of coaching folks who do say, I want to get rid of these medications from my life, and I want to move on and I want to feel healthy. And I think I read something where someone said, I felt like it would happen right away because it seemed like it happened right away for Laura. But you just said it can take years to get somebody off of one of these medications. So if you can explain a little bit about how you talk people through this. And then also, I got the impression that you also coach them through those moments of, I'm having a panic attack. I must be having a relapse. No, you can get through it. There are ways to get through it. So tell us a little bit about that.
So for anyone who's kind of on a medication, trying to come off of it, or have tried in the past and didn't go well, First, there's this nonprofit that I started, Inner Compass Initiative. And so over there, we provide people with free information and resources for learning about so many of the things we talked about today and more. Learn about how to read the drug label for your medication so you can better understand its risk profile and all of that. How to learn about the history of the DSM. We have all of that information there. Because I think it starts there. It starts with educating yourself, which is not easy. It takes time and it can be complicated. So we have everything organized on our website that we think is, what people need to know that they're not being told. And we also over there have a self-directed tapering manual. So we basically took all of the layperson wisdom in the withdrawal community, and by that I mean the tens upon tens of thousands of people all around the world who have been forced to figure out for themselves how to taper off of these meds safely because the medical system does not acknowledge this is a real issue. There are no safe tapering protocols that have been officially endorsed in the United States. So we lay people have become the experts on this. So we have a free manual at the website that walks through how people taper off of these drugs, right down to pictures of how you use a syringe to make a liquid mixture. It's like very granular over there. And we have a community over there as well of people helping each other in a mutual aid capacity. I do offer, coaching and consulting support to people who want one-on-one support. I don't do a lot of it. I do, but I know it's an important thing to offer people. And that's separate from the nonprofit. And we also have a group support program where people at all stages of the journey off of these meds can kind of come together and really like figure out how to feel and be with themselves in the wake of all of this. Because that's the thing, when you're psychiatrized, so many of us are so afraid of our pain and of being with ourselves that when we decide to leave it all behind, we have to learn how to do that, how to just be and not try to fix it, like you said, not try to shut it down. So, but the way I see it, there should be freely available information and resources and community for people. People shouldn't have to pay. You shouldn't have to pay me. You shouldn't have to pay anyone. And that's why our nonprofit ICI exists, because we believe it's a right for all people to get this for free.
What you just said, afraid of being with ourselves, that really strikes a chord, because I do think that a lot of people have felt like, oh, I'm too scary without some sort of aid. And this is helping people through that. You have a book too. Can you tell us about the book quickly?
Sure.
Before we get off.
It's called Unshrunk, A Story of Psychiatric Treatment Resistance. And it's available through my website, lauradelano.com, and all fine booksellers. And it's a memoir about all of this, plus a lot of research and history woven in. And my hope is that it just helps continue this conversation and can serve as something hopeful for people, that there's another story for you beyond what the mental health industry tells you about yourself.
I love it. Thank you so much, Laura Delano. It's been a joy talking to you. And I know I kept you extra long, and I want to say I appreciate it. Thank you so much. Such an important topic.
Oh, Tudor, I'm so honored to be on your podcast, and thanks for everything you do. I'm so happy to be here.
Oh, absolutely. And thank you all for joining the Tudor Dixon Podcast. For this episode and others, go to TudorDixonPodcast.com, the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts, and join us next time. You can also watch the video on Rumble at Tudor Dixon. Join us next time and have a blessed day.